Did you know that Spotlight On is completely self-funded by the team that produces it? We're looking for ways to keep the podcast self-sufficient without sacrificing the listener experience or the integrity of the show. The best way we could think of was to ask for the support of our listeners. Please consider making a donation to help cover our annual operating expenses. Go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click the word donate. If you can, please do, and if you cannot, please continue to enjoy the show. We're happy to have you as a listener. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight shines on clarinetist, penny whistle player, composer, improviser, and educator James Falzone. Observant listeners will recognize that name, as James and I have been collaborating on an upcoming live event, Improvisation in Music and Life, which will be taking place on June 22nd at the Royal Room in Seattle, Washington. That event will be a unique program of performance and conversation between me and the five-piece James Falzone Division Ensemble. We're going to explore the nature of improvisation in music and how its principles can be useful in all aspects of life, not just for musicians. There are still some tickets available for that event at theroyalroomseattle.com. And that's not the only special attribute of this show, as it's a bit of a two-parter. This discussion was recorded back in early March of 2024. I reached out to James shortly after seeing him perform with the bassist and vocalist Katie Ernst in their duo Wayfaring. I was initially hoping to record them together, but an even better outcome came about. I had separate discussions with each of them, which allowed us to expand beyond their work together and learn more about both of them as people, and as players, and as thinkers. Thus the two-parter. Next week's episode will feature Katie Ernst. As for today's episode, we recorded this talk in person in a very special space at Cornish College here in Seattle, where James is both a dean and professor of music. I was very excited to sit in the room the school's founder, Nellie Cornish, likely used as her sitting room and her study about 100 years ago. It was also a thrill to consider that I passed through rooms where John Cage and Merce Cunningham likely met or spent time. I have to thank James here for making that happen. Thank you, James. James and I spoke for nearly 2 hours that day. His instinct to record in person on a Saturday in Seattle allowed us to go slow and let the conversation unfold. As always, I'm grateful to producer Michael for transforming the discussion into what you are about to hear. As we parted ways after our session, I mentioned to James that I was starting to think about the next batch of live shows for Spotlight On. He immediately offered ideas and inspired me to get working on it sooner than later. Following up over email, we developed the concept we will be bringing to the stage in June and to the podcast shortly thereafter. I cannot wait to see it manifest, and I hope to see you there. In the meantime, my talk with James Falzone. Being from Chicago, obviously, as like you said, rich musical tradition. What was your first music? As a kid, were you already a deeply sort of sophisticated listener? Were you pop music of the day? We're roughly the same age, so I know what I was listening to, but where'd you start?
It's a great question because I wasn't really that into music, and I don't have a great explanation of why I wanted to play an instrument. I was 10 years old, and my public music school teacher, so hooray for public music school, she was letting us listen to Peter and the Wolf, the classic by Prokofiev, where he goes through the different animals represented by instruments.
Yeah.
And she would hold up flashcards of the instrument while we heard that particular moment. And I was just a football playing, not very good academic kid, nothing special. I had a sister who played piano. She was quite a good student, so my parents put a lot of energy into her piano lessons. She shows this flashcard in class, and I say, that looks kind of fun. And I went back home and I said, I think I want to play a musical instrument to my parents. And my mom's brother is a professional musician. He was a great woodwind player, and he's a film composer. Kind of mostly retired now, but he had many successful years as a film composer in L.A. He's won several Emmys, and he was a fantastic jazz saxophone player. So she called my uncle and said, all right, the kid wants to play clarinet. And he had played a bit of clarinet himself, so he helped me get an instrument and so forth. Pretty immediately after playing the instrument, I got hooked on jazz. I wasn't listening to a lot of pop music of the day. In fact, I had to catch up to a lot of rock and pop later on in my high school years.
Interesting.
But 10 years old to 14 years old, it was all about classical music and jazz. By the time I was in 8th grade or so, I just thought down upon anything that was not Coltrane or Stravinsky.
It's an attractive trait in a 14-year-old.
Yeah, it was pretty ridiculous. But my uncle was great. He would come visit over the holidays, and we would go to a record store, and he'd buy me lots of different records. And my parents helped me get a great stereo system. So I was deep into jazz and classical music in those sort of junior high school years. When I got into high school and I started hanging out with friends and forming a friend group, they were all really into what I would call more like progressive rock bands like Yes and Rush and things like that. And so they started playing that stuff for me, and I was always like, yeah, it's okay, it's all right. But I then found myself in high school getting really into, so this was being the 80s, getting really into English synth pop and new wave bands, things like that. So it was a weird combination, mostly all about jazz and classical music, and then putting on my Depeche Mode records when I wanted to do something that wasn't about that music. So it's funny to think back upon that, because I could never really relate to what people were listening to in the moment in terms of pop music. And then one more thing I would say is that Peter Gabriel became very important to me. Besides liking his music a lot and liking his song structures, he made use of a lot of world cultural music in ways that was very deep and authentic, not appropriating, but truly appropriately appropriating, right? Bringing in musicians from around the world to play on his records. And I became fascinated with those sounds, and then I would go explore those sounds. So I remember first hearing the sound of this particular flute, not knowing what it was, and that it listed on the record. He was very good about putting the musicians on the record, that it was a ney flute player, Arabic flute. And so I began to research that instrument more and understand where that comes from, and then that would lead me to learning about the oud or the qanun or whatever it might be. So I'm very grateful to Peter Gabriel for taking such care on his records to bring in these great musicians, but also actually tell you who they were, what they were playing, so I could go learn more about them.
Interesting that he also came from the Prague tradition as well.
Yeah, right. I think that's where I got connected, because my friends were like, you got to hear this Genesis record. And I was like, it's all right. I don't know. It didn't really do much for me. But then I liked what he was doing and would follow his trend more than, the early bands that he was in.
Yeah, it's funny. I go back to the Peter Gabriel era Genesis records occasionally, feeling like I should like them more than I do. And there are individual songs I really like, but it's more revered than it is good.
Yeah, a lot of music is, that's for sure. If you did any research on me, you may have found that there's this interview with me in which I admit that I'm not a big Beatles fan. That to me falls in that category. Like, I have total respect for that music, and I know their place in musical history, but the music itself just doesn't do much for me. I didn't grow up with it. It doesn't have pull on my heartstrings. My parents weren't playing Beatles records on Sunday mornings or things of that nature. So I just approach it like any other music, and I say, yeah, I get that it's good, but it doesn't have any real place for me. But yeah, I think that So record, the Peter Gabriel So record from about 84, 85, I mean, that's a pivotal record to me. Like the sound of it, the production, the instruments that he's using. Yuso Nador shows up on that one track. I'm forgetting the name of the track right now.
In Your Eyes.
In Your Eyes, thank you. And then being able to trace back, okay, where's he from? Oh, Nigeria. And all this music to explore. I'm very grateful. I hope someday I get to meet Peter Gabriel to just thank him deeply for that influence on me. It's huge.
That record's it's so inescapable, but to be such substantial music. It's interesting as well to go back to some of that 80s synth pop music now. I just listened to a fairly long interview with Trevor Horn, who produced much of that stuff.
Yep.
That music actually is so well constructed, and I guess you could say like professional, but catchy as hell. Like it's really like, if you had said to me 40 years ago, you're going to put in, I don't know, an Art of Noise record and be blown away as an older man. Yeah. But some of that music is really incredible.
That was an era in which they really cared about production, about song structure and so forth. I think Tears for Fears is another band that comes to my mind, is just really caring about all that structure and so forth. Even like that song Red Rain, right? I will forever be fascinated by the hi-hat pattern that Stuart Copeland plays, which is an overdub. He's not even playing it with the kit. It's overdubbed hi-hat on that record. totally adds to the rhythmic interest of that particular song. Yeah, we could probably geek out a long time about that record.
Well, the other thing I want to say, though, is the person who provided a similar model for me was Bill Laswell.
Yes.
And he's on that record.
Yeah.
So Bill opened a lot of doors for me in terms of being a genre hopper, a genre integrator, access to so much great world music. And he was really my entryway into Eastern Arabic music as well. It made an amazing record with Simone Shaheen.
I know that record, yeah.
When I was still living in New Haven, Simone played in one of the chapels at Yale. It was part performance and discourse. So he would play a few pieces, talk about the history of the music. It was the perfect type of thing to go see.
Amazing musician and amazing ambassador for the music. And that summer camp he's run for years, I don't know if you know about that, but it's a summer camp for Arabic music, Middle Eastern music traditions. Many people their lives have been changed by that summer camp. I would say, too, it would be hard to not talk about U2 as well for me. And not only the Unforgettable Fire, the production on that record, the Brian Eno production, again, really set certain sonic elements for me. One of my teachers in graduate school, a pianist named Rand Blake, always talked about, you've got to understand your musical DNA. If you're an improviser, why are you making the choices that you make? Can you trace them back to certain things that stuck in your musical way of being, right? That DNA that you can't get away from. And I would say that those records in the mid-'80s from groups like U2 and Peter Gabriel, of course, along with Coltrane and Stravinsky and all kinds of other stuff, but those records, they're there as part of my musical DNA.
Yeah.
In ways that I'm not always sure I can understand. But the sound of Unforgettable Fire, that record, the overall sonic imprint is something that I feel like I still think about, and it's there in the way that I play the clarinet, the way I produce sound and so forth.
Interesting you say that, because now I can hear that. I can hear the space in the productions on your record.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, very, very uncluttered, but yeah, they breathe.
To me, it's all about sound, right? As a woodwind player, I'm putting breath into a piece of wood with a little bamboo, piece that vibrates and makes the sound waves. So it's all about sound. And I would say that in a way, if we just take those two examples, the Gabriel records and the U2 records are really all about sound. And there's great lyrics and cool grooves and things, but the overall production of those records is what I was really attracted to.
Yeah, because both those artists made very strong records before those records, but those records in particular were the ones that skyrocketed them.
Yes.
The other thing that I would say about that era before we move on is that it's a lesson that I think was lost on the modern music industry, which is there were a lot of left of center people allowed to make very big budget records back then. Like they let the weirdos have at it.
Yeah.
Whether it was a lot of those English bands, like those were basically either punk kids or art school kids and talking about Kraftwerk and Bowie, and just let them have at it. And then who would have thought to let Brian Eno make a Talking Heads record or make a U2? I mean, really an incredible time. And to me, the lesson is let the weirdos have at the pop stars. Put them in a room together.
Well, I love that you say that, because another influence which is local here is Robin Holcomb, Robin's music. I remember getting one of her None Such records. Again, a major label I know Robin well, so I don't mind calling her a weirdo, but like an off-center songwriter make a pretty well-financed record. And that record had a huge influence on me. I got it from the local library in Chicago. I was probably in 8th grade or freshman year of high school. Wow, this is songwriting that I can connect with. There were some great jazz players from New York on it. That's well said. Like, that was a time when you had left-of-center records that were super important, and you could find them pretty easily.
Well, None Such is a great example. They did some important work in the 80s in terms of they let Zorn make some records and just the distribution that comes with a major label. Like, I'm sure there are musicians that we know and that you've worked with or what have you who are from places not in urban centers who came across None Such records that probably changed their lives.
Yeah, agreed. And on the jazz side, I would say the same thing about ECM, the ECM level,
of course.
Right? Those records, the early Pat Metheny records, the Bill Frisell records, and many, many others, those have such a sonic imprint. I was just listening to one on the way here, this great Swedish folk musician named Ale Mulder, who produced a bunch of great records on ECM. Just the sound of those records, I will always try to imitate them. And some people don't like them, but I don't mind saying I do. I like.
What's the criticism that you hear on that? What's the knock on it? Because the imprint, the sonic imprint is, I find it comforting and enjoyable.
The critique is usually too much reverb, which is natural reverb because he's often recording in churches and things like that, but it's too spacey. It's too open. People will critique the music for being a little bit too, I'll use the word soft or not angular enough, something along those lines. But I think the major critique is the sound, that it's not close mic'd. It's very atmospheric, and it sounds like you're in a church. If you know something about me, I don't mind being in churches. So the sound of that is totally fine by me. You know?
Yeah, I was going to say, so to me, everything you said, it's like, those are all positive attributes.
Growing up in Chicago, coming out of the free jazz scene in Chicago, which I love, and those are my dearest friends, many of them, we would have many a fight in a tour van talking about, I would stick up for ECM. And how could you listen to that crap? Because they want to hear things right up front. And it's all about the sound of the music in terms of the players, right? So close miking, having a much more upfront sonic imprint. Anything that has where you've got to sort of listen in somehow, I think, is not interesting to some people.
Yeah. Just to go back to Chicago for a few minutes, and that time frame when you picked up the clarinet and you mentioned your uncle, I'm assuming as a physical presence, he wasn't always there.
True.
So who was navigating you into the world of Coltrane and Stravinsky and whatever else you were listening? Like, how, did you have a musical mentor, or were you just dropped off at the record store and you went for it?
Well, there's a little bit of all that to play. So first off, Uncle Jim DePasquale is his name. I was in part named after him. I called Uncle Jim all the time. I can't believe the guy gave me so much time, to be honest.
That's beautiful.
I would just be 9 o'clock in Chicago and it's 7 o'clock in LA, and I would just call him and say, I've just learned about somebody named Schubert. Can you tell me about Schubert? And then Uncle Jim would stop his life and tell me about Schubert. Very grateful to him. Uncle Jim grew up in Chicago. He went to Northwestern. He was very involved in the Chicago music scene until he went to New York and then LA. Before he left, he was a very good friend of a great jazz musician by the name of Richie Corpolongo. Richie is still living. I'm hoping to see him in just a few weeks when I go visit Chicago. Richie is a saxophonist, clarinetist, the quintessential jazz doubler. So he played saxophone, great saxophonist, great clarinetist, played bass clarinet, played flute, all of the woodwinds so that you could have a career as a working jazz woodwind player.
Yeah.
Uncle Jim got me connected to Rich Corpolongo when I was 11 years old. Now, as an educator, I can say, Lawrence, that I was getting a graduate education when I was in junior high school. I would go to Richie's house for a Saturday lesson, and the lesson would last an hour, and then I would usually cut his lawn to help pay for the lesson. Then I would go back in, and we would talk more about music, and he'd play records, and we'd talk more and so forth. So it was pretty deep. At the time, it was also really hard because he was incredibly demanding, and I was practicing a lot, and my brain development couldn't always keep up with what he was giving me. And so I would be practicing, and it wasn't getting right, and he was a taskmaster. So sometimes it was painful. But that was the person who was guiding me.
Different time, too.
Different time. We can't advocate for that kind of education these days because you'll get sued. But it was the right thing for me at the time, right? It was the kind of thing where you'd practice, you'd have an etude or something you're working on, you'd bring it in, you'd play it really well, and he'd say, yeah, but can you play it backwards? So it was never, you could never figure, you'd never satisfy him, right? But I tell you, by the time I got to college, I looked around and I was like, wow, how come people can't do these things? And I realized I had been given a pretty special education. Sometimes when Uncle Jim would come in from California, they would give me double lessons, the two of them in the room, and they're old buddies, right? And they would just be coming at me like, you got to do this, you got to be able to do that, you got to be able to transpose it, you got to be able to play this in this key. And it was overwhelming at times, I have to say. But I was so smitten by music that I put the work in. It was fascinating to me. And I would hear these records, right? I'd hear these great musicians. And I'd just be like, how do you do that? How do you get to be able to play that fluidly? How do you make sounds like that? Well, okay, the answer seems to be I have to keep working at this to be able to master the instrument. Then that's not enough. I have to know something about theory and harmony and composition. That's not enough. I have to know about orchestration. How do I write for different instruments, And I had a couple of good buddies around. I went to a good high school, a public high school in the suburb of Chicago, and there was a couple of great musicians there, and we would get together and jam and try to figure stuff out, and had formed little bands and things.
Yeah.
And, playing jazz. I remember this great drummer, Darren Scorza, who's still a great player in Chicago. We would just get together and play tunes and probably sound terrible, but we could do it together in a safe space because we were 12 or 13 and nobody was listening.
Who were your guys? You mentioned Coltrane a few times now. It sounds like maybe you're an Eric Dolphy guy.
Yeah, for sure. Dolphy was important. Charlie Parker, all the jazz greats, Richie and my Uncle Jim were great about just getting me schooled with the traditional players. So I had a ton of Charlie Parker records, and I transcribed some of the solos, and Coltrane and Eric Dolphy, Ornette Coleman. Richie was definitely a more experimental, free jazz player, schooled very much in the tradition of playing over changes and so forth, but he loved to play in a more free context. He was exposing me to all kinds of people, late Coltrane, Ornette Coleman.
Did you stick with Coltrane till the end?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. In fact, I started at the end. I think the first record I got was Love Supreme, and then I got Interstellar Space and Ohm and all those later records, and I just thought, this is what he sounds like. And then somebody said, have you heard Blue Train? I didn't, and I went back oh, that's a whole other side of it. So, and because I'm a clarinetist, there's a certain element in which I had to find clarinet heroes, right? And so the first couple of clarinet heroes were actually a very deep Seattle connection, a guy named Bill Smith, who's also known as William O. Smith. And Bill lived here in Seattle for 40 years. He just died a few years ago. When I moved to Seattle, I started spending time with him. He was a big hero of mine. When I was about 12 or so, I started listening to Dave Brubeck. Brubeck was a great musician. And he had this clarinet player named Bill Smith on many of his records. And Bill was really not very well known. Incredible clarinetist, great jazz musician, great improviser. And so Bill was a big hero of mine. And I got to spend a lot of time with him here. When I moved here, he was in his 90s and starting to become quite ill, but we played duets together. And
that's beautiful.
Yeah, it was great. Eddie Daniels, another big name in the clarinet world, a jazz clarinetist. During that time, late 80s, early 90s, you could count on one hand the people doing clarinet in a jazz context. There's a lot more now, but at that time, there was really not very many. And then around 92, I suppose it is, I can't remember the exact year, but came along Don Byron, who is a really important jazz clarinetist. And when I heard that first record of Don Byron, which was called the Tuskegee Experiments, I was sold. At that point, I was playing a little saxophone because it was unclear if I could make a living as a working musician just playing the clarinet. It sounds crazy now because there are so many clarinetists these days, but late 80s, early 90s, there really were not that many, and many were doublers playing multiple woodwinds. I was playing saxophone. I had a really good one. That record came out. I listened to it just nonstop and transcribed things and just understood what he was doing on the clarinet is what I wanted to do. And then I sold my very nice saxophone, went to Europe and backpacked around with the money, which was awesome. And I've never played anything but clarinet and penny whistle since. Those are my doubles.
For the benefit of listeners, can you talk about why a clarinet player can play a saxophone?
Sure. It's really about the reed. So they're both single reed instruments.
Gotcha.
So you're not dealing with any other kind of embouchure, right? Embouchure is where you put your mouth and teeth on the mouthpiece. For instance, playing flute is a whole other embouchure.
Yet saxophonists often play flute.
Yeah, very true. Because of the big band tradition is very much where the book that you're playing, let's say you're playing the second tenor in a big band. The second tenor might have times when you have to play flute and or clarinet. So you need to be able to play those doubles to be able to make a living playing in that music. Now, the truth is, big bands are no longer a big thing any longer. They're still out there, and it's awesome, but that's not so much a part of it. I was always interested in original music and creative music, and I didn't want to play other people's music. But it's mostly about the embouchure and then fingerings, yes, as well. Now, the clarinet has a little different structure than saxophone, which is why a lot of saxophonists struggle with clarinet. The fingerings do change in the second octave, which messes saxophonists up. So a lot of people, when they'll call it, like the punishment stick or the pain stick, things like that.
That's awful. You know? It's like playing the piano, and then all of a sudden, at this end of the keyboard, that's
right. You got to change your fingering suddenly and think in a different way. But I think I was becoming a decent saxophonist, but it never felt comfortable to me. It was never something I had a voice on, and I was glad to be able to.
You stuck with the pain stick.
I stuck with the pain stick, and it's not painful to me. It's joy and beauty. But I have to say, now there's a lot more clarinetists doing creative music and jazz and so forth. It's Anat Cohen and Francois Houle, and these are all people who are friends of mine, Mike McGuinness, and I could go on and on. There's just great people who are playing the instrument and really focused on the clarinet now. It's great.
You filled in a great gap in sort of your story for me, because I was curious as to the sort of how and why behind going to conservatory. I wanted to ask you a little bit about conservatory training, and as that impacts, influences, contrasts with, conflicts with being a new music performer, and especially improvised music. Like, was there room for being an improviser in the conservatory you went to, or was that trouble?
What a great question. The term, of course, means conserve, to be conservative, right? To hold on to a tradition. So let's backtrack one step. So undergraduate, I went to a state university. And then for graduate school, I went to a conservatory. At the state university level, I was a classical clarinet major. So I played in orchestras, I played in chamber ensembles and so forth. I was learning the instrument in a very deep way. But I had a very open-minded clarinet teacher. His name was Mel Warner. He's passed on now, but he allowed me to do a lot of creative things, and that was rare. Normally, clarinet teachers, especially back then in the 80s, 90s, would have been like, you play this repertoire, then you play in the orchestra, your recital needs to be the Mozart clarinet concerto, very prescribed way of doing it. And Mel said, I can see your interests are different. You want to pursue this instrument in a different way. I want to give you the training, the mastery of the instrument so that you can realize whatever you want.
Thank God.
Right. What a beautiful, beautiful thing. I've always had good teachers. So my junior and senior year recitals, which are supposed to be playing repertoire of the instrument, he allowed me to play all of my own music. Amazing. I'm not even sure he should have gotten away with that, but because there was like actual hoops you had to jump for as a woodwind player studying at that school that he allowed me to get around in different ways. But what's wonderful is he helped me gain mastery of the instrument. Now, the clarinet is so hard that nobody ever masters it. But, at this level, I have a certain proficiency on it. I'm grateful always to Mel for that freedom and also the discipline about how to be a really good clarinetist. So then I took that undergraduate degree. I started working in Chicago as a working musician, forming my own groups and so forth. I had gotten married at that time and started thinking about life in the future. So then I thought I should go to graduate school because I think probably at some point I'd like to teach. Like to be involved in the university setting. I've always liked the life of the mind and learning and libraries and things of that nature. So I thought that's probably a good place for me to have a foothold in. But I also wanted to pursue a next level of artistry. So I started looking at what's out there. There's always been jazz programs, but I wasn't interested in studying jazz. And at that point, there had begun to be more open improvisation programs. So my master's degree is actually in improvisation. Writ large. Yes, jazz was a part of it, but so was Indian music and Arabic music and free improvisation.
Interesting. So any tradition with an improv element.
That's right. Yeah, I was studying the art of improvisation, and then I could figure out how I wanted to, assign that to different kinds of playing. There are now many more of those kinds of programs. We've been developing that here at Cornish, which I can talk more about at some point. But at that time, there weren't very many, and I found one of the only 3 or 4 in the country, which was at the New England Conservatory. At that time, it was called the Contemporary Improv Program. But it was founded by Gunther Schuller and Rand Blake, and it was first called the Third Stream Program. Third Stream was this belief of Gunther Schuller that, You took classical music and jazz, you brought them together, the two streams, and they formed a third stream, which was this genre-less music that was bringing in these different influences.
Sounds very European.
Yeah, and very ECM, by the way, going back to the former conversation. That's where I went to conservatory, and the NEC, New England Conservatory, is a very special, open-minded place, right? To your question, a lot of conservatories will indeed, still to this day, conserve the tradition. If you're at Juilliard and so forth, they're expanding these days, but still, if you're a violinist going to a place like Juilliard or even NEC, you're stepping into this long tradition on your instrument. And there is a kind of repertoire and a tradition to conserve. I did not experience that at all. I experienced quite the opposite of a complete openness of being able to study anything I wanted to. But it's because of that particular program founded by Gunther and Rand Blake. Now, there are many more programs like that, even at the undergraduate level, like here at Cornish. But you could go to University of Michigan. UW here in Seattle has a program that's more open.
Can you talk a little bit about how the modes of pedagogy have changed? Like, we talked about on the individual level, the types of teachers you had. I've talked a lot in other conversations on this podcast about when my son was little, he started playing piano at 5. He went to a music school in Brooklyn where the first day he came home from a lesson, he could peck out a little melody, 3 or 4 notes, but he was playing. And so he was excited and he jumped in and he was off to the races. When I started taking piano lessons at 5 or 6 years old, I don't think I touched the piano for a year. I sat there with theory books, drawing half notes and quarter notes, and it was awful. It was very stereotypical, like mean, stern female teacher. Sorry, but that's
maybe a little hand slap once in a while if your hands weren't curved.
It was awful. It wasn't. There was no joy.
Yeah,
there was no joy. And so I'm curious both at what you've seen there and how that's influenced the students now that walk in here. Like, are they coming in differently? And then what happens here that's different than maybe a generation ago?
Beautiful question and a deep question. It deserves its own podcast about education itself.
We'll do it again.
Yeah, right. Unpacking your question, let's kind of go it from different vantage points. So let me start with Cornish. One of the things that we've experienced here when I got here several years ago to look at the music program is that students were coming in with many different kinds of vantage points who were still good musicians but didn't have the traditional ways of coming into music studies the way that I might have had. And music schools were missing out on a lot of really talented young people who, because they didn't have 10 years of music lessons like I did or maybe you did or others, they still needed to come in. They might have been making beats in their bedroom with GarageBand, right? But they have a lot of really great musical potential. So one of the things that we were thinking about when we kind of reformed our program here was this notion of sound before symbol.
Sound before symbol.
Symbol meaning notes, notation, right? These 5 lines and so forth. Your son immediately started learning music by the sound of music. What is music about? It's about sound. It's not about symbols. Notation is a relatively recent part of music's history. Music's been around, from the beginning of time. Even before then, I would offer, metaphysically speaking, notation is a fairly recent development about how to put that stuff down on paper. And of course, many of the world musical cultures don't use notation. So we train musicians how to read here, of course. You can't leave a music school, I believe, without learning how to read music, because it allows you to have a certain fluency to be able to have a career in the art form. But we no longer require it to come in. That's been a big change in the last even 10 years.
That's incredible, actually, to hear that.
And there's also a component there that has to do with the economics and
There's an
racial
equity
disparity,
element.
an equity element, absolutely. Like, you're missing out on a great gospel pianist who does not read music, but can play the hell out of the instrument and has incredible ears and great sense of arrangement and musicality and ensemble playing and so forth. So if the litmus test, and it was here for many years that you had to read to get in, we have changed that here. So now you don't have to read to get in. Our first music theory class starts with how to read, but you can test out of that if you know how to read. So we've created a system here, an ecosystem, which allows different ways of interacting with entering into music school.
That's incredible.
And I feel really strongly about it, and I notice that many other departments are doing that now. Now, there are still folks who say, no, that should not be. You've got to have a standard of at least coming in with this level of musicianship. I understand that impetus, but I would just offer, ask yourself how many great musicians you are missing if you do.
And by the way, that modality only works in the world where we still had great music education in the public school context. Like, so where you're going to get kids that could afford to have private lessons for 12 years?
Yeah. The problem is if you hold entry into undergraduate music studies as being able to read music, you're negating the last 25 years of the exodus of music education in the school system. Go back to what we were talking about 20 minutes ago. I started playing the clarinet because I had a public music teacher full-time showing me flashcards of instruments. Now, my son's public high school, he's lucky if he gets, a theater class once in a while. They actually just cut that at his public high schools.
You mentioned being around 10 years old when all this happened, so around fifth grade-ish.
Yeah, that's about right.
When I was in fifth grade, the first half of the school year, the teacher had us clear the desks out of the room into the sides of the room, and we square danced twice a week
Yes.
to records.
I did some square dancing too, yeah.
And then the second half of the year, she had us listen to a box set version of Carmen.
Wow.
Yeah, in public school in fifth grade. I don't even know what class that was supposed to be. It wasn't music class.
Right.
It was incredible.
And that's changed so much, even for your well-funded public schools. Though that training is now gone. Yet people are still fascinated by music and doing music and making music and kids playing instruments. And even if they haven't had a lot of lessons, they're learning how to play the piano on their own, or maybe they picked up a woodwind instrument or something, or they're playing bass or guitar. We have a lot of students who come into Cornish who have never had a private lesson. So their first lesson is here at the college level. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a struggle at times, because we've got incredible faculty here who are saying, wow, this student really doesn't know what it means to practice. So that's our job, is to help them figure out, like, yeah, you got to put some time in on this instrument or with your voice or with your songwriting, whatever it might be. They get it pretty quickly, because you don't apply to a school like this unless you want to pursue this passion. And that's what we're looking for, is the level of potential. I'm more interested in how a student graduates than how they come in.
That's interesting, yeah, because it's a self-selecting bunch anyway that show up at your door.
Absolutely, yeah. Graduating artists who will likely not have any particular kind of job waiting for them.
Terrible ROI on this.
Right, yeah, that's exactly. And I've got a kid in school right now in college, and I understand that you're looking at, okay, I'm going to be shelling out some money here for my child, and they're going to be working hard. What is going to happen after this? My training as a musician makes me ready for almost anything. Young artists make great administrators. Often, not always, but very often, they can think in conceptual ways. They're systems thinkers, right? They know what it means to be self-disciplined, right? So even if you come out of a BFA in dance here at Cornish, which is one of our legacy degrees here, it is hard to find a career in dance right now in America. My daughter is a dancer. I'm watching her work through that. But the discipline of dance, the discipline of thinking as a choreographer, as an improviser, as a maker, you can do so many things with that work. And I think that's what we're helping our students to do. Now, in a larger way, though, I just want to say that there are still very conservative music programs around the country. If you're interested, look at my Facebook feed from the last couple of weeks, because I actually got into this issue regarding a Juilliard professor who made some public rants about his students, and I took him to task about that. What's interesting is that the post I made, which was rather long, I'm surprised people even read it, but it was shared a lot. 600 times was shared. I think it just touched a nerve because we're in a moment in which music schools have to rethink how we're doing this project of educating future musicians. And I have to say, even though I encounter some curmudgeonly thinking these days, I also encounter some really exciting things. We're in a moment of really seeing things change, and I'm excited about the future of music education at the college level, which then filters down to the public school level and the private instruction level. I think there are some really great teachers around there. Now I think people are realizing, again, sound before symbol. Get them making and experiencing and enjoying the sound and the beauty of music, and then fill in the blanks. You can play these chords, you're getting a facility of hearing it. Let me show you what you're doing. And when you put those two things together in that order, it makes more sense, and it becomes more, I think, enjoyable. And who knows what young people will do with that, if they want to pursue it as a career or not. But if they don't, they've got this knowledge about how music works. And
Well, talking about all the changes in the world and in the workforce and in the greater culture, someone coming out of art school with a degree in dance or any of the arts, they're going to be a lot harder to displace in the workforce. It's a lot harder to teach an autonomous robot to do modern dance than it is to teach an AI to replace a computer programmer.
A great point. Here at Cornish, one of the areas that is most concerned about AI is in design. We've got a wonderful design program here.
That industry has been decimated.
We had a presentation this week or last week from one of our design faculty who was showing us that Adobe products now use AI for recommendations. So you might be working on something and it might say, would you like me to do this part of your design for you? He was showing us how this works, and indeed, it was making some fairly interesting design. The students and the faculty were looking at it going, oh, I had no idea it would be quite that compelling. You're right. There's not going to be a lot of AI stuff replacing your local improvising clarinetist, thankfully.
That's another rabbit hole that we can go down, and maybe we won't go too deeply, but I have felt over the last 6 months or so that there might not be a better time to be an artist. Like, first of all, we need artists given the state of so many things in the world, but they have so many more tools at their disposal. The AI thing in design, it's been so disruptive to the commercial part of the industry, but I would imagine it's a lot of fun for a fine artist, or I guess this is a little bit of ignorance or maybe idealism, but it doesn't strike me as that different from Jeff Koons or somebody else having a studio full of people. He's giving them what amounts to prompts. He's setting the North Star. He's saying, this is what I want.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a great analysis.
I mean, maybe.
The person who's listed as the composer is not doing all of the work. They have a whole army of people doing orchestration, coming up with melodies, all kinds of things. And that's been a way of practicing in film scoring for a long time now. So that's a really interesting point. AI, I think of it as just a room full of people helping you out. I accept it in so many small ways. I use Google platforms a lot for various things. It now finishes my sentences for me, and most of the time it's right, and I'm fine with that. But I would get nervous if it's finishing my music for me. We just have to make decisions about it, I think.
The thing that I've said a few times on this podcast when the topic comes up is I am much more worried about AI in the context of like weapons systems than I am in a lot of other areas.
Yeah, for sure. Let's get real, right? Yeah.
In reading a bit about you in your biography, because you're sort of like the ideal guest on this podcast in that you're a multi-hyphenate. And actually you find that most people are. But I'm really curious, do you have a line of active research you're involved with? And if so, what is that?
The answer is yes. I still have an active line of research. Because I still am a professor and teaching needs to be fueled by constant research, right? So I teach an improvisation course every spring for our students, a required course for every student who studies music here, which I'm proud of.
That's great.
I'm always trying to keep up with the current research about thinking about improvisation and about how to teach improvisation, even outside of jazz, right? This is not a jazz improvisation course. It's improvisation writ larger. There's a whole area of academic study that is about critical studies in improvisation, led in some ways by a great scholar named George Lewis, who's a great trombone player, but also a scholar about this practice. So lots of reading and research about improvisation practice. That's a big part of my life still. I go to conferences to learn and hear people present on it, and I present myself on that subject. So that's a big part of it. Also, the research, what I would call practice-based research, which is for us as artists, practicing artists. Like right now, I'm working very deeply on, this gets really nerdy really fast, but I'm working deeply on ornamentation on penny whistle traditions. Penny whistle is an Irish instrument that I've been playing for many years, but in the last 2 or 3 years, I've really been going deep into the history of the instrument, into certain kinds of ornamentation styles, then trying to transfer that into my own language as a composer and improviser. So that's some pretty deep research. Like, what does that mean? It has to do with listening, sometimes reading, sometimes finding videos from different archives. There are some places that archive very traditional Irish music traditions.
That's incredible.
So I'm looking at that stuff and trying to figure out what's happening there and so forth. There's constant research. I'm not in a library as much as I might have been in the past. Now it has to do with the practice-based research of it. Getting together with musicians is research, and working with other musicians and practicing together and finding common language is research. But I would say particularly it's about keeping up with the understanding of improvised music and the literature and the body of research that's coming out in that field. There are some great things happening in that realm. University of Guelph in Canada now has a whole institute of research on improvisation. And so a lot of what they produce, I try to keep up with.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On right after this break. Tickets are on sale now for Spotlight On's next live event, this time at the Royal Room in Seattle, Washington on June 22nd. Spotlight On Improvisation in Music and Life will be a unique program of performance and conversation between me and the James Falzone Division Ensemble. Together, we'll explore the nature of improvisation in music and how its principles can be useful in all aspects of life, for musicians and non-musicians alike. Different types of composing in the moment will be demonstrated, interspersed with interludes of discussion covering what each musician brings to and gets from the experience. In the Q&A session, audience members will become participants and access a rare opportunity to gain deeper insight into the art and science of improvisation. For tickets and other information, visit theroyalroomseattle.com. For those of you who cannot join us in person, we'd still welcome and appreciate your support in the form of a ticket purchase. If you can, please do. It would mean the world to us and to this important independent venue. Thanks. And now, back to Spotlight On. Something that's been very exciting for me and that is reflected a lot in the guests we have on is there's a really great, I was going to say movement or scene, but it's probably multiple scenes making up a movement in Western Europe, specifically Germany, Switzerland, of this sort of, if there was a Venn diagram, it's improvisation, jazz, and electroacoustic music. So people coming from an electronic tradition, even maybe a hip hop tradition, but integrating improvisation.
Yes.
In the way they're using the tools on stage even, and processing and giving things for musicians to respond to. Really exciting music.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And that's happening here too. Last week I had two great musicians from the Bay Area visiting, Philip Greenleaf and Scott Amendola. Philip's a saxophonist and Scott's a great drummer. And Scott was live processing his drums while they were improvising. And he also had a microphone on Philip and capturing live sounds and processing those. So yeah, that's coming out clearly out of an electronic music, hip hop kind of sense of live processing. But he was doing it while he was playing drums in a really organic way. Big influence on a lot of improvised practice right now. And I love it. I don't myself work in electronic music, but I love working with people who are using that in a great musical way.
It's a sign that the music is alive. It's still moving, and it's still innovating.
Agreed, yeah. My only concern is it's boring to watch somebody playing a laptop. We got to train our laptop players to look a little bit more interesting.
What they're doing is so interesting, and there's no way to convey that.
Yeah, it's funny. I went to this conference last summer in Europe, and there was a guy who was doing live processing in an improvised context, and he had a screen showing what he was doing. And I was really into it. He was controlling Max XP, I think it's called. It's a pretty sophisticated platform, and I could watch him doing all the stuff. So I mean, that's one way to solve it.
It's funny you say that because I like Kraftwerk a lot, and I'll go see them any chance I get. And I went down a YouTube rabbit hole of people were able to film angles in the room of what they're actually doing, standing there at those podiums. Because there's this big debate, like, are they just pressing a button and standing there? Yeah. And they're not, obviously. I mean, maybe not obviously, but they're not. I can definitively tell you they are not. Yeah. They are improvising, and it's truly amazing to watch what they're doing. Yeah. The different software they're using, the controllers.
Last week I went to a concert here in town at the chapel where you heard me play, and there was an electronic musician who was playing. Uninteresting visually it was, right? He was just a solo artist. The music was fantastic. I was really enjoying it. But it completely took out the element of interacting with a live performer. I was really enjoying the sounds, and so that's no problem. But I thought to myself, I could have stayed home and just listened to this.
Yeah.
Because the performance element was gone. So I thought to myself, maybe he should have done it off stage and put a film up or maybe he just needs to think more about the fact that he is performing.
Yeah.
I don't really want to look at somebody just with a glow in their face and clicking. I know that he's doing incredible things, but I have to have some kind of synergy with him as a performer. So it's something that I think we're in the infancy of. It's only been happening the last 10 years, 15 years. So we'll see it change.
Yeah, because in the old days, whether it was something like Tangerine Dream or even some of the ambient artists, they had these big banks of equipment. So it was a little bit more dramatic to watch them.
In a hip-hop context, DJs or people who are spinning records and things, they're super into it. They're grooving along with it and so forth. I just feel like right now the more improvised electronic musicians could be reminded that they are on stage in front of 50 people who paid $20 a ticket to get in. That may sound a little judgmental, and I hope it doesn't sound... It's more of like a concern, because I want that music to be successful in live contexts. And sometimes I just think, you're on stage, friends.
There's a group here that puts on ambient shows. I think it's called Reflections or Age of Reflections. They've been doing it in a couple of the churches. They have these full immersive light shows that take up the whole room in the church. So that gives you something to interact with. The sound also, I think, might be in surround sound. So it's a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more to get involved with rather than just watching the person.
I'd be interested in that more. I'd like to check them out. Again, I don't want to be dismissive or judgmental because I really enjoy the music. I just am cognizant of the performative aspect of playing live music. So if you're going to play live, electronic, improvised, interactive music, that performer needs to just take into consideration that from the audience perspective, it is not terribly exciting to watch somebody working behind a laptop.
It's like what a lot of the EDM DJs have done. Like they've taken to wearing costumes or, it's hard to...
I don't have any good answers, but I do notice it as an issue.
I want to talk about Wayfaring in particular and some of your work, obviously. I wanted to ask, what, if any, influence or role does the concept as well as the actual musical influence of minimalism play in what you do?
Well, first I'll say that I've studied that music pretty extensively, the history of what we know as actual minimalism.
We had Carrie O'Brien on, by the way, a few months ago. Yeah. Well,
one of my closest friends.
What a great book.
And taught here at Cornish for several years, now caring for her very cute son. So I've studied the music extensively, Steve Reich and all the classics. And I have written music using those techniques, because I think one of the things to remember is that minimalism has some technique behind it, right? Some compositional practices that you can employ, the idea of phasing and so forth. It's not just a sound, it's also a way of making. So I have taken some of those elements and used them in some of my compositions. I think that's important to say. But then if your question is a little bit larger about a reduction of material that you might be working with, that's something that I think is influencing more and more as I get older. I love that Carrie and Will's book starts with Miles Davis.
Yeah, it's incredible. The recontextualization they did is amazing.
Exactly. And that's helped me talk about, again, back to research, reading that book and talking with Carrie about minimalism. Yeah, Miles was the ultimate minimalist in a lot of ways, right? So just that the choice notes, like if you think of the solos on Kind of Blue, right? The choices that he makes are so minimalist. Yes, the actual techniques I have thought about and used, and I've recorded some of that music. I have a recording of Steve Reich's New York Counterpoint, which is for 11 clarinets. But also just thinking about a reduction of material and choices. Last night, we had a faculty concert here, and I did an improvisation with two of my colleagues here, Greg Campbell and Heather Bentley. And it was a great moment at the end. The last maybe 3 or 4 minutes, I was playing some piano, and it was so clear to me that there was nothing more for me to play. Greg was making sounds, Heather was making sounds. There's an audience. One's ego could say, hey, you're the dean at this college. You should play all the way to the end, right? But I'm so glad that my training and my experience and the long hours I put into this practice have just said, no, there's nothing for you to add. That's a minimalist approach, right? That it's about nothing else except what the music needs.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that minimalist thinking has crept into my work. If I have a 30-minute car ride, I'll put on Steve Reich's piano phase, which drives some people crazy. But I don't know if you know that piece or not, but it's this looping piece that has two pianos that are moving in and out of phase. And the patterns that develop in that are still just fascinating to me. I like elements of that in my own music at times. And that's the great thing about being a composer, thinker, music maker today, is that everything's fair game. You could put in some moments of very traditional choral writing, worked into some minimalist writing, worked into some free improvisation, and it all can work now. Awesome.
I had a piece I was working on for a while that was playing with phasing, and I loved all the weird sounds that came out of it, whether they were sonic artifacts that were acoustic in the room or whether it was in the GarageBand file. It got so dissonant. I loved the dissonance of it, and everyone I played it for was like, that's like cars crashing. And I'm like, yeah, it's great. I love noise.
It is funny when you realize that as musicians, the things that we just don't think twice about for some people are very disturbing. Last night at this concert, a colleague of mine here who teaches at Cornish and outside of music was there. And at the halftime, the intermission, she came up to me and she said, is the rest of it going to be this atonal? And
you're like, if we're lucky.
She meant it very, very, very well-meaning. But I said, there was nothing atonal in the first part of this concert. Like, it was totally consonant. And I realized the divide between musicians and non-musicians. Now, she works in costume design. She could come up with the most radical costumes that I might look at and go, what the hell are they wearing, right? But in her medium, that's just normal, right? But she comes to a concert and she wants to hear some melody and some traditional rhythms and so forth. It's just, even at a funky art school like this, we still have got work to do in terms of helping each other understand, each other's mediums.
Let me ask you a question that I hope it's not too cheeky. What is the difference between noise, sound, and music?
So let's start with music, just if we'll go with that one. So there's a great book called On Music, or What is Music, by Theodore. I'll have to get it for you and you can put it in the podcast description. I can't remember the name. He's a philosopher who's interested in music but not a musician. And he's got a lovely, short but very meaningful book about defining music. So I'm going to stick with the fact that music is organized sound.
Organized around time?
Well, maybe, yes. I mean, music happens in time, so it's inevitable. But it's organized sound, and I'm going to take out, it used to be called humanly organized sound. I'm comfortable leaving the human part of it out.
They have to be.
Right? Organized sound, right? Because if it's not organized, I would say that it's not musical. Now, don't think that I mean organized has to be systematic in some way, right? Cage's 433 is a way of organizing sound by allowing no organization for the sound. When I say organization, I'm talking about a very open, terminology there. But I'm going to say that that music happens when the sounds are organized. It may be organized by the listener, which I think is what Cage was getting at. It may be organized by the composer, by the improviser, and so on and so forth, right? Sound is a naturally occurring phenomenon at all times. In our conversation here, it's happening with our voices and the sounds of all that we're making, but the cars going by and the HVAC system going on, which has this nice drone for us. It's happening all the time.
I kind of like that.
Oh, yeah. It's always around. I was working in a wood shop once with a friend of mine who was helping me learn about making furniture, which I can't do and I'm terrible at it. But one thing that happened to me is that the machines that were running were creating intervals that sometimes were perfect minor intervals. And I'd find myself getting very melancholy during this hour working session. And I realized that's because the pitches were creating these sort of minor chords for me, which was just triggering me into kind of like a sense of quiet kind of introspection.
Doing what minor chords do.
Right. And he, of course, never thought about it because he's just used to it. But sound affects us all the time. I was organizing that into something that resembles music because I'm so attuned to it. That's how I'm differentiating between sound and music. Sounds are the building blocks of music. Everything is sound. The organization of it, whether it's humanly organized or organized by happenstance or whatever, that's when things get musical. Now, your question about noise, I guess it's not a category for me. I'm not going to really find a definition for it. I don't think of anything as being noise.
I think a defining attribute of noise is that it's artificially generated. If it's naturally occurring, it's sound. And that's completely arbitrary on my part, but it's what's stuck in my head.
Artificial, who would create it artificially, or what would create it artificially?
Well, here's where your point completely challenges my assumption. A machine makes noise. A volcano makes sound.
Because one is natural and the other is fabricated or man-made.
I don't know why noise, I relate noise to something that has to do with industrial process. There wasn't noise pre-industry. Or maybe even the first Bronze Age tools made noise.
Interesting.
It's stupid, I know.
No, I appreciate it. Although I would encourage you to walk down a street in which there is a lot of industrial noise and organize it as musical.
That's the thing. That's where I'm completely wrong, because I hear those same things as well. In fact, I love the rhythm of machinery. I use machinery as building blocks in a lot of the music or a lot of the soundscapes.
I love the question, Lawrence, and you're challenging me because I don't think I have a category for noise. It's just sound or music.
Yeah.
There's this phenomenon where you can get really irritated by hearing people eat. It's a psychological, cognitive thing that has a name for it that I'm
once
forgetting.
You notice it, sort of you become fixated.
Yeah. And I'm sitting around the dinner table with my 3 kids and my wife, and I'm hearing them all eat, and we love to eat and be together. And I've been growing as I get older. The sound of people eating is like disturbing to me, but I still wouldn't say it's noise. I can't figure out what I would constitute as noise. So I'm just going to keep it as 2 categories, sound and music.
Yeah. I think to close on that, I think noise has a negative connotation. Noise is like, this is not important sound. And that's bothering to me because, to your point, it could be an element of, you could use noise.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Cage, who really helped us realize that all sounds are to be embraced. Right, all sounds are there as interesting and as potentially musical if we'd like them to be, but just let sounds be what they are. Man-made, volcanoes. I've never thought about the sound of volcano. I like that.
Or a waterfall.
Or a waterfall or anything. A waterfall can be a very intrusive sound, right? You can't have conversations around it. The HVAC system allows us to still have a conversation. If we were near a waterfall, this conversation would have been over.
It's ridiculous. So you and I are here because I saw a performance of your small group, Wayfaring. I guess duo would be an accurate way to say it.
Right. The smallest of groups.
Well, I guess if you were... Yeah, all right, fair. One of the pieces that really blew my mind to see live, and by the way, I hadn't listened to Wayfaring before I saw you. So I walked in not really knowing what I was getting.
Oh, I love it.
I love going to shows that way.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that, for taking the chance.
Oh, thank you. Who put the blood?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of questions I have about that piece. First was seeing the 2 of you perform it and watch the different things you had to do to build around what Kate was doing was incredible. The sonic world the two of you created.
Yeah.
But then when I listened to the recording, I couldn't believe how much of it you pulled off live. I was expecting the recording to be much different. Mm-hmm. Did you record that piece live? It doesn't cheapen it to say there are overdubs at all, but do you record live with her? Is all of that you picking up instruments? And
so there are overdubs on that particular track, but we always record live. There's always an element that's live. So I believe on that recording, the bass line clarinet circular breathing thing that I'm doing, and her vocals are live, and bass. She always plays bass and records together. So we're very dedicated, and I always am dedicated to as much live as you can make in a recording. There are lots of ways to make records. Peter Gabriel, like going back to our earlier part, a lot of that's not live, right? It's Frankenstein together. Totally cool, viable way to make records. For what I want to do and for what Wayfaring is about, it's really about the interaction between Katie and I. So we want to have as much interaction going on as possible. The initial thing is the ba-ba-dee, ba-ba-bee, ba-ba-ba-ba. That thing is happening with me, circular breathing, and her playing live and singing. Then we put some overdubs on top of that. What you experienced in the moment of us doing it, I think the smoke and mirrors there is the circular breathing. People can't quite figure out what's going on. And then if you don't see my foot, you don't know that the drone is coming from the Shruti box, which is I'm pumping with my foot.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, okay. Well, and then, Katie has this great ability. It's rare for somebody to sing as beautifully as she can while she's playing.
It's impressive.
It's a great thing. There's examples of Esperanza Spalding and people like that, but Katie does it in a way where you really feel like the two are not. You're wondering if somebody else is doing something because they don't seem related.
That's exactly right. The melodic bass line she's playing is such a different melody than what she's singing.
That's right.
And she's not singing. I don't want to over-describe it because it's so compelling to watch.
I haven't thought about this much until recently. Our last tour, a lot of people are now commenting on that particular song because it's now documented on the record. We're filling up a lot of sonic space, right? So the harmonic spectrum goes from these low frequencies to these high frequencies. When you get bass, clarinet, Shruti box, maybe some bells, and her soprano voice all going at the same time, you're filling up a huge amount of that sonic space. That's going to produce some sympathetic partials and harmonics that are coming out. But all that stuff's ringing and moving around. There's a lot of sonic ground we're covering, and I think people's experience of that is like, there's got to be somebody playing something on a laptop or something like that, but it's not. It's just us filling up that space.
Can you tell me anything about the murder ballad as a form, or like, why did murder ballads exist? Was murder that common?
It seems to be connected to themes of the Middle Ages, of medieval balladry. In the Middle Ages, going around and telling epic stories and tales before any kind of recordings or notated things are happening.
And death ballads and epics.
People are going around telling these stories, right? And we still love a good murder, right? I mean, I love mystery novels, and we like to watch TV, detective shows and things like that. It's just kind of a fascinating thing for humans to experience, right? The idea of telling this story about somebody getting murdered, that's often about like the mom finding out that there's blood on this boy's shirt, and what happened there, young man? Oh, I killed a rabbit, and but that's different blood than a rabbit should be, and then it comes out that's actually a person, right? That whole story, that has been done so many times, right, in these kinds of stories. So it appears to be lodged in a medieval sensibility of storytelling that then starts to have accompaniment to the story, right? The troubadours who would go around telling these stories, they would accompany themselves almost like a film score. And then I think at some point, you actually start putting a melody to it and making a song out of it. By the time you get to 18th, 19th century, especially in the British Isles, these become songs that are passed down from
They're
generation.
a bit more fixed.
Yeah, they actually have a set kind of text. You've got different variations of them. And then as immigration starts happening, let's just take the Who Put the Blood, there's also this element of Irish immigration going on. Because you've got to leave the country, go to America. I don't think it actually says America in the story, but it's pretty evident that's where he's going. And that whole idea of fleeing because of some kind of problem in the homeland. I don't know if it was at the show that you heard, but Katie had mentioned that There's even a little myth in her family background that one of her relatives came to the States in the early 20th century because there was some kind of altercation back in the homeland. A very common, sometimes mythologized story, but yeah, you'll find a version of that song 30 different times, a little different allocation of who got killed or who did the killing or whatever it is. But
in other cultures as well, because I know you have experience creating music of other cultures.
I mostly see English versions of it. There are probably versions in other cultures. I've not seen those, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a version of somebody leaving Lebanon or Syria that's a very similar kind of thing, or other parts of Asia. But I see many variations coming out of the British Isles. Scottish version, English version, Irish, Wales.
Bloodthirsty bunch.
I know, yeah. Yeah, and it's often about the immigration to Australia, to the United States, maybe to mainland Europe.
How do you and Katie come up with the repertoire?
It's very often just sending us a track as a text, like, hey, what do you think of this? And then I listen and I go, nah. Or I like, I think we got one there. And then we'll get together, and I'm going to Chicago next week, and we'll get together and just figure it out. How do we want to present it in a way that's authentic to us? Who Put the Blood was literally that. I was listening to a version of that while I was washing dishes. I can still remember. And I just thought, oh, Katie will kill this one. And I just texted it to her and found a track, found a sample of it, and that's it. Many of the songs on our first record come out of, we were both directing music at churches, and so we experienced different hymns and old spirituals that we just thought would work well for the group. So there's an old spiritual where she's playing like a banjo style accompaniment.
Yeah, I remember she's plucking.
That's right. That, again, just a song that I had sung through the church and just thought it would work for us. And so very often it's just us passing ideas back and forth. Sometimes, if it's an original composition, we'll actually bring something in that we've written for the group, and it exists on sheet music, and we'll work it out that way. I think what's important for that group is that the melodic material, the compositional material, is relatively simple. We're not going for super complex things, at least not in the actual material itself. We make it more complicated by the arrangements and what we do with it. But the material itself can exist on one piece of paper or just one concept if it's not been written down. It's what we do with it that becomes more complex. We've taken an old murder ballad that is usually just somebody in a guitar accompanying themselves, and now you've got this extended clarinet technique that's holding the whole thing together in a way, which is just our unique contribution to the music.
Yeah. It's interesting about circular breathing because I'm trying to play melodica. And I keep watching YouTube videos that are like, oh, circular breathing's easy. You'll learn in 5 minutes if you watch this video. And I watch all those videos and I try to do it. And I'm like, I can't do it. And I'm like blowing bubbles in glasses.
The good thing about it, it's a bit like juggling. Once you figure out the pattern, you never cannot do it again.
That's sort of what I'm gathering. I
Yeah. Once your muscle memory clicks in about it, you'll realize, oh my gosh, I can never not circular breathe again.
That's good.
You might get better at it over time. I've gotten better at it. But yeah, it's really muscle memory and developing some specific ways of understanding the technique. I learned it without ever having anybody teach it to me. I was just interested in it, and I just kept working at it until I figured it out. It's also the way I taught myself how to juggle 3 balls of socks until I was like, I'm not going to leave this room until I can figure out this pattern, and I did, and I'm pleased.
Of your ensembles, is Wayfaring, do you view that as an ongoing concern? Because I would like another record, please, and maybe another show.
Well, I appreciate that. Katie and I are dedicated to keeping it going, no question. We're enjoying the success of this new record, and we have a show in Chicago and a show in Boston. I'm working on some concerts for us in the UK this summer. We'll keep on keeping on, no question. It's interesting. We're of different generations, right? We just have a really great musical relationship, and it just works. She's not afraid to get into some really transparent and authentic and scary places as an improviser, which is always what I want to be able to do. And then both of us can stop all that and just execute a line, which is also really important to me. Her incredible singing. She's just a great person to hang out with and be with. And we have very similar kinds of interests in melodic shapes. Like if you've noticed, like a lot of what drives that group is about melody.
Sure. Melody and arrangement is the two things.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's harmonically, It's not that sophisticated rhythmically. We're kind of always in this range of rhythms. It's about the melodic shapes and the delivery of it in terms of thinking about the sound development of how we present it.
Where have you been on a long summer's day? Son, tell it unto me. A fishing and a fowling in the fields and in the forest. Oh, weary mother, let me be. Weary mother, let me be. And who put the blood on your right shoulder? Son, tell it unto me. It's the blood of a hare that I killed yesterday, and I killed most manfully. I killed most manfully.
In the spirit of the multi-hyphenate, and I saw this maybe referenced in one of the workshops you do, or in some context, but the idea of the musician entrepreneur. You're a musician entrepreneur, you own a label. I'm just curious, the modern artist, the modern musician has to be so many things now. You have to master social media and maybe these production tools and all these things. Can you talk a little bit about like your realization / coming to terms / embrace of all those roles? Like I can't imagine as a teenager or even in conservatory, you thought, someday I'm going to be marketing my own music.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, looking back on that, it was still of a time when I was in undergrad and even in grad school where you still did things like shop around your record.
Right.
That was still a concept.
Like somebody might actually pay me for this.
Yeah, right. I might go to like an office in New York and say, can I have 5 minutes of your time? I mean, that was still kind of a concept, right? My recital that I did for my graduate, sort of been year 2000. I wrote this kind of sweet length piece that had some great musicians on it who are now quite well-known musicians, but we were all in graduate school together. And it was a really great performance that was recorded very nicely. And I thought, I should release this. I should shop this around, right? Year 2000, I was living in Boston, so I started contacting some people. You know, of course, nobody was interested in releasing some weird improvised hour-long suite, right? So I started thinking, what if I just do this myself? How do you do that? How do you actually produce a CD? Because at that point, CDs were still the only real mechanism. So I just learned how to do it. When I realized, oh, I could start my own label. It gave me the power and the control to do things the way that I wanted to do it. I could choose my own art on the cover. I could do a CD release when I wanted to do the show. Everything about it, just, wow, I can just do this on my own, not have to worry about anybody else. Any of the sales come to me, all that kind of stuff, right? So I did. I learned how to do it. I learned about mastering. I learned about production of the actual product. I learned what it means to put on a CD release concert and maybe do a small tour and all that stuff. At that time, I didn't even have a website. I just thought of that, okay, this is release one on this idea that I had formed, which I call allos musica. So allos means other. So it was a way for me to say, I make other music. Hard to categorize, not a real easy genre-based music. And then I just started to say, well, okay, if I'm going to do this, I better get a little bit more serious about it. And then, to your point, I had to learn about website design. I had to learn about distribution of records. Okay, it's one thing to have this thing that I can sell at a concert, but I only get 30 people at my concert. I want to sell more than that. So then I started thinking about online marketing. And this was when the web was really bursting open and you started to have things like CD Baby, which were helping you to sell stuff. So I'm now on my 17th release. The Wayfaring release is 16. I've got another one coming out in April. That's going to be the 17th. It's been a joy. And it's interesting because I've had some really great reviews in big publications in the New York Times and Downbeat. It hasn't really amounted to any bigger paying gigs, right? I mean, in some ways, like I take all that with a grain of salt. It's great to get your work out there and to get
It's
people
fun to see your name in
It's
print.
fun to see your name in print, all that stuff. But truly what I'm interested in is the synthesis of all these things coming together, because for me, it's about live performance. I want to be on stage, not because I want to be egotistical, and that's not what I mean. I want the place for improvised music is in front of people.
Yeah, it's fun to play in front of people.
It's fun. Hopefully it's fun to experience. I want to curate an experience of that. One way to get people involved in that experience is through the recorded medium and through online presence and so forth. But I was talking to my wife the other day. I was like, remember when I used to send postcards out about my gigs? I'd have some gig at a local jazz club in Chicago, and I'd send out 100 postcards that say, hey, I'm playing at the Empty Bottle on such and such date. It's the same thing. It's just now I can put up one Facebook post and reach 5,000 people in one fell swoop, or at least that's number of friends that it says I have. So it's such a complex thing, and it fills me with wonder about how to get students right now to think about that. And I don't want to overwhelm them by that stuff because they can think, oh, I've got to get my brand together. It's like, no, you got to learn your fucking scales, dude. No, you can brand yourself later, but right now you can't play your instrument very well.
And
So,
your brand is you're a bumbling fool.
yeah. I mean, and they will say stuff like that. Freshmen coming in talking about getting their online presence together. And we all chuckle a little bit and say, we'll get you there. But right now we need to get you to sing in tune or learn what a G major chord is and so forth. So it is hard. It is complex. I'm comfortable with it, though. It's really a joy to have different means by which you can let people know what you're doing. Recordings, online presence, social media, playing gigs. I mean, it's all coming together. It all comes together in a rich, organic life, and there are people who do different parts of it better. There are people who run their own labels who certainly sell more than mine do, or have more airplay or radio play or whatever. But I'm pretty comfortable with it all right now. It feels good,
As somebody just getting to know your universe, so looking at it for the first time, there's certainly an aesthetic visually to the discography. I'm not familiar with every note of all of it, but we talked a little bit earlier that there's this breathy openness to the sound. Like there's an aesthetic for sure.
I think because I had such good training at an early age, I probably arrive at an artistic voice a little earlier than some people do. I would say by the time I was in my mid to late 20s, I was doing what I'm doing now. And I almost get a little embarrassed by that. I mean, I've grown certainly as an artist, but if you listen to me when I was 29 or 30, it's not that much different to who I am at 52. I guess that's a good thing. Like you find a voice, you stick with it.
You're living the life of an artist.
Yeah, right. You hear about people having these major changes. I'm a big fan of Ervil Peart, the Estonian composer.
Yeah.
Estonia this summer, and I went to the center that's based on his life. And there's this documentary film about the pivotal moment when he discovered the tintinnabule series of pitches, and now he made this major shift in his composing. And I was just like, I could use a major shift.
I didn't get one of those.
I'm still doing the same thing I was doing 15, 20 years ago. I enjoy it, but I just notice how I have this thing that I do, and I've been doing it. And the truth is, I feel very comfortable with it. That's why it's great to have somebody like Katie, who's younger than me, who brings a different energy. I do play with older musicians sometimes who bring a whole different energy, and so this is a great mix.
My version of that moment is obviously it's not as large, but my sort of epiphany or breakthrough moment was the permission to do it, because I hadn't really been creative on my own behalf. I'd always been helping other creative people with their vision. I hadn't been creative on my own behalf since probably my mid-20s. Was the last formal band context I was in. And just over the last few years, I gave myself permission to do it again with 20 some odd years of life experience and technical experience and business experience that I could bring to creativity. And that's the permission to do it.
I love that. Age brings wisdom, not always,
and a certain sense of like, I don't give a fuck.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. Like you understand how things are working. You understand. I mentioned that choice last night to not play.
Yeah.
That's a 50-year-old move. That's not a 30-year-old move. I would have entered back into that sound last night when I was in my late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah, I was telling you, the phase piece I worked on it for, I don't know how many hours, but I worked on it a lot over a period of time. I'm probably going to throw it out. And I'm so comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Whereas before I used to think if I made it, I have to finish it. Like I have to figure this thing out and finish it and put it out and master it. Like, now I'm like, it's not really working for me. Or maybe I'll just listen to it sometimes.
Sure.
And do something else with it and sample it. But it was like, I don't care.
That's the lesson of the Buddhist sand paintings, right? Like spending days and weeks of creating these intricate sand paintings and then just blowing it away, right? The transience of it all, I think, those are important lessons.
So, all right, you're bringing me to my last question, which is, you mentioned earlier, you made a reference to sort of music always being there, even before time, or you were talking about it's been there for millennia. You said metaphysically it's always been there. And I wonder, what is your metaphysic, or what is the role of metaphysics in your music?
It's a fascinating question to ask any artist.
Yeah.
In one sense, I have a background in the church, in Christian church. I worked for the church for 14 years, directing music. It's a powerful experience. Working for a church or a synagogue or anything like that, it's completely service music. You've got to be making music for the people, not for yourself. And I'm so glad I learned those lessons, right? Because every time I let my ego get in the way of the music, the people suffered, right? So it was completely about serving them, and I really loved that experience. There was a time in my life when I thought I was being called into theology or being called into being a minister or a PhD in theology, things of that nature. I've always been fascinated from a young age by how people think about spirituality, about God, writ large, like comparative religion. I took a lot of coursework in comparative religion.
Yeah, that is all fascinating.
Yeah, I want to understand how a Buddhist thinks, how a Muslim thinks, how an atheist thinks, and all these things coming together. My own personal vantage point is coming from a Protestant Christian background, but that's morphed and changed and so forth. So for me, there's this belief in the Middle Ages about musica mundana, the music of the world. There's the music of the world, and there's the universal music that's just existing in the universe. Sound is always there. And that what happens when it becomes musical is that we enter into it and make it musical, but that all those sounds are existing at all time. I'm pretty comfortable with that. So to me, music is a kind of sound is a kind of foundational experience of being human.
That's a Sufi point of view as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of different religious vantage points have the same kind of concept. I have a lot of friends who are involved in sound healing, where they're using actual frequencies to help people with different ailments and so forth. This is not just metaphysics, this is science. Like, we know that frequencies actually can change brain waves, which can help people deal with anxiety or deal with blood pressure issues, things of that nature. So I really do see all those things. And I'm not interested in sound healing as a practice, but I'm interested in my music being healing. Right, so how can I bring that kind of sentimentality into my work so that music still, even though I'm making music for my own aesthetic reasons, it can still be service music. I care that people listen. A lot of composers and musicians just don't. I don't really care if anybody likes my stuff. I'm just going to do my thing. I get it. I totally understand. But the truth is, at the end of the day, I care if you listen. Doesn't mean I'm going to pander to you or make something that's going to be like more easy for you to listen to, but I care about bringing you into the moment.
Isn't I don't care a defense mechanism? Isn't that, I mean, that's the thing I was taught. It was the person that tells you, well, I don't care, that's the person that cares a lot.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, maybe so. The older I get, the more I care about how people listen, if they listen. Again, I want to make sure it's clear that's not about trying to pander to the audience or necessarily grow an audience, but whoever is there, I want to bring them into the experience. It's a little bit why the way that Who Put the Blood came together, the idea of starting with this repetitive pattern using circular breathing is not by mistake. It draws you in because there's a moment where you're saying, why isn't he breathing? Oh, he's doing something, and you're intrigued, and then Katie starts singing this haunting lyric, and then here comes this drone, and it just, it's there to draw you into the whole experience. I teach this course on Fridays for a retirement community that they asked me to teach a course on protest music.
Oh, wow.
So I'm teaching this online course for people in their 70s and 80s and maybe 90s. It's all on Zoom, and they're just lovely, and I can just see them in their rooms, it's called Wesley U. It's the Wesley Retirement Community. And that's like their little university, right? So it's so awesome.
Keep the people engaged.
Yeah, exactly. And some of these folks are deep people, doctors and lawyers and deep educators who are now retired or maybe in assisted living. Maybe they're dealing with Alzheimer's or dementia, whatever it might be. Anyway, yesterday I played for them Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam. Now, many of them had never heard it before. And those who did had never really analyzed the words before. So here, everybody in that space was white. And here we're listening to this song together. And I actually played them a live version in which Nina Simone you can just see the pain and anguish on her face. It was recorded in around 65, I think. I think it was in Sweden. So after some bombings in Alabama. So the very reasons why she wrote this song were still going on. And we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things we talked about is how that music, she purposely drew you in, because it starts off in this like musical theater kind of, if you know the song, it's like bum 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 bum. Mississippi got me, I think Alabama got me so upset. That's the first line, right? She draws you in by having music that is completely unrelated to what she's about to say. And I was just reflecting on that with these folks yesterday about how absolutely genius that is. I mean, true genius manipulation of music. She cared if you listened. She needed you to listen. Was she changing the words or the storyline? No, she called everybody out.
Yeah, she was serving the dish cold.
Totally cold, yeah, exactly. She controlled the medium of music to make sure you were drawn in so that you wouldn't miss the message. Now, I'm no Nina Simone, and I think of her as a high watermark up there with Bach and Coltrane and everybody else. But I'm interested in that same thing. I want to draw people in. Going back to your earlier comment about the entrepreneurial aspect, I want to draw you in by having an online presence that has a certain aesthetic, visuals that have a certain aesthetic, the records have a certain aesthetic. Hopefully the way I just go throughout my day, the way that I dress, everything just has a way of saying, I'm interested in connecting with people. And this is the medium that I use. My work now as a dean here at a college, it's the same thing. I'm just trying to get people to take this work seriously and draw them into the process by having meaningful interaction. To me, it's a very spiritual practice. Making music is a spiritual practice to me, and it's connected to the spiritual practice of just being alive.
It's a good place to end. James, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What a blast.
Yeah, it's absolutely my pleasure, and we could talk a lot more, and thank you for the good, thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much, James Falzone. Looking forward to seeing you in June. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host and executive producer, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and edited by Michael Donaldson, with theme music by Q Burn's Abstract Message. If you'd like to support our work, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, or visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, weekly postings, our official blog, and a ton more. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.